Hi, Cassie. Lovely to see you and welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you for having me today.
Oh, a pleasure to have you. And I come across you on Instagram, and I thought, wow, this woman has the most amazing story. Obviously, it's a shocking story, but I just felt compelled to contact you and ask you to come on the show because I think survivor stories are really important, and your story could help many women out there as well. How are you anyway today?
I'm
Looking
doing
good?
great. Yeah, I
Yeah.
just got settled into a new, more permanent place for myself. So,
Nice,
yeah.
nice. And whereabouts are you based at the moment? Or is that's we can't say that actually at the
I
moment, can
can't
we?
say exactly where I
No,
am, but I'm
no.
in an RV park. So I'm in a little
Okay.
camper with a kitten if she does some drive-bys today.
I've got a
But
cat
yeah,
too.
yeah.
So where are you originally from?
I am originally from West Virginia, also known as like the Appalachian Mountain area. And West Virginia in the United States is very, very poor, very rural, very, you see movies like Deliverance made about that area.
Yes, the Appalachian people is something that's quite new to me. I knew of mountain folk, and I was telling you earlier, I was doing a bit of research on the
Yeah.
Appalachian people. Can you give me just a little roundup of the culture of the Appalachian people?
Yeah, well, I mentioned the movie Deliverance, and I want to say that that is not representative of the state, first of all. But the Appalachian people, I mean, we're very much, we live off of the land, we understand the land, or at least we used to. But my family, specifically in West Virginia, we appreciated the earth. It's a very poor area. And because it's so geographically isolated, there's not a lot of education. You see a lot of like high control religions in the area. It's part of the Bible Belt. So there's a lot of people keep to themselves generally in that area.
Yeah, yeah, it's a quite isolated area, and it goes from, is it Georgia up until to New York? Is that
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Appalachian Mountains are vast.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And you have quite a rich history in West Virginia, don't you? Your
I
family.
I do.
Uh,
I joke. Yeah.
yeah. So do you want to tell me who your is it great granddad was?
It's like 4 or 5 times great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he was Devil Anse Hatfield of the Hatfields and McCoys notoriety. Very famously, there was a feud that went on for years and years from, I think, 1863, don't quote me on the date, until later. And they were feuding over a pig or a hog. But the thing that people don't think about is that was a year's worth of money. That was an inheritance, possibly. So, anyway, we got painted in a stereotypical fashion when people were just actually trying to look out for their families.
And he had like 14 kids, didn't he? He had quite a lot of
I, I
children.
don't remember,
Yeah.
honestly.
And
Yeah.
the McCoys, I think he had 17. I was reading about it. It's really interesting because
Yeah.
he was they were friends beforehand, I think,
Mhm.
weren't they? And this is the time of the Civil War and civil unrest. And
Yeah.
they were fighting between the river, is that correct?
The Tug River that
Yeah.
separated
Yeah.
Kentucky from West Virginia.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's actually a little Romeo, like I like to call it a hillbilly Romeo and Juliet story that went on in the background too between the two families and a young man and a young woman.
Yeah, it's really interesting actually, and if anyone gets a chance, do a bit of research on it because I find that really fascinating, the whole story behind it. But it's
Yeah.
great that you've got a bit of fame there and you're
Yes.
infamous in West Virginia. That's marvelous.
Yes.
It's a
Yes.
good story to tell, isn't it?
It is.
Um, so with your family, do you have a big family as well, or
No, I have a very, very small
yeah?
family actually.
Mhm.
And actually, I'm one of the last living people at this point. So,
Okay, okay, wow. So we're going to be talking about your trauma and your story, and I think it's really poignant that we take we take this step by step. And if you ever feel uncomfortable throughout this conversation, do let me know. We'll
thank you.
stop. But yeah, I wanted you to really just start off and tell your story from when you was a child, what it was like growing up, and when things started to change for you.
Yeah. So I grew up, I had an older sister who was 6 years older than me. She had profound intellectual and developmental disabilities. So she relied on someone else to take care of every one of her needs. She didn't speak, she was nonverbal. So I was born 6 years later. And the story that I was always told was that my sister had a birth injury, that a doctor was drunk when he delivered her, and there was $1 million lawsuit set up because of that. So I was, I would eventually receive this inheritance. And I never really thought much about $1 million. I mean, I'm from poor Appalachia. Like, I don't care about money. And I never thought what that money could do to people and to my story. And so I grew up, my mom stayed at home with my sister and I because my sister had great needs, but it was also a control thing of my father, I know now. And I didn't understand it at the time, but I was actually living two lives at once almost. So I was living a life where I had all the expensive toys, all the newest gadgets, all the electronics. We had a swimming pool and RV, like a full size RV. But my mom, being the Hatfield, she's the Hatfield side, was from the hollers of West Virginia and had grown up very, 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 very poor. And so I saw my cousins and other family members living not far from that, living in abject poverty. And I did not think, you're a kid, you normalize what your experience is. So I was not thinking about the fact that why do I have all of this money when really we don't? That wouldn't happen until I was 39 years old and applying for student loan forgiveness. And I saw that I had $20,000 in Pell Grants, which require basically abject poverty to get, but we'll put a pin in that. So I grew up and I had a wonderful, fantastic mother who was just the epitome of what a mother should be. And she really made magic out of a bad situation. Um, I remember when I was a kid that I was very, very intelligent. I did things like theater. I was charismatic. I never got in trouble in school. Never once got in trouble in school. And every now and then I just have these emotional outbursts. And looking back, it was PTSD. It was in the creation and it was anxiety and things like that. But it was very like OCD when it would come out. It was very, someone had wrinkled a piece of paper or something, and there was just this emotional meltdown. And so, um, my mom, again, was a fantastic woman, but she had had such a tragic childhood herself. She had experienced childhood SA. I'm not sure that some of the things that happened to me didn't happen to her with her being kind of bought and sold. Um, can I say the word? Can I?
Trafficked.
Yes.
Yes, you can say that word. That's fine.
In Appalachia, there are actually, just in general, there are a few different ways of trafficking, but one of the
Right.
more familiar ones in Appalachia is sending kids someplace to do work, and also sometimes that involved SA. So I'm not sure something didn't happen. She had a grandfather who had substance use disorder that was extreme. She was parentified as a child, was basically the mother for her three younger brothers. I remember my grandmother would kick her out of the house, and she had an infant brother, and she'd have to take all the kids down the holler to her grandmother, my great grandmother's trailer, until my grandmother decided they could come home as children. They were worthy of coming home. So it was just a very tragic childhood. So when things started happening with my sister and I, it's no wonder she missed a lot, because the brain normalizes the abuse so you can survive it, so you can live through that. And so there was a doctor's office in town, just maybe 15 minutes outside of where we lived. And it was an urgent care. And that was the only place that my father would ever allow us to go. Now, he didn't have insurance. He worked at a car lot. He would just wash cars when they came off the lot and somehow sustain the lifestyle that we had through that income. And no one ever asked a question when it was maybe $4 an hour. And so in any event, was
My
pacing the
mom.
hallways and she was extremely frantic and upset. And she kept asking all the doctors, please, can you just get me a female doctor? My daughter is absolutely terrified. She's absolutely terrified. And finally, they sent in a male doctor who was very callous and very cold and just poked around at my privates. And I was diagnosed at 8 years old with HPV. And that fact combined with some of the other things that I had done as a kid, because there's something that happens when when a kid is essayed, they get activated too early in that area. That it's called reactive. I think I can say this word: reactive sexual reactivity. And
Okay.
so
Yeah.
with sexual reactivity, kids basically are playing what they have learned because kids play to understand. Kids play to kind of deconstruct. And so there were times that I was acting out on my mom or attempting to in that way. It was also
Wow.
going on in the neighborhood, and it was like all
Wow.
of us. It wasn't one kid preying upon another, which tells me that it's likely that this was a very widespread issue, which is
S-
not
s-
surprising.
So just to confirm, they were the doctors that did that to you.
Yes. Now, I
Wow.
I always talk about the doctors because they were the orchestrators, they were the main ones, they were the ones with the money to make things disappear. But it was not just doctors. There were landowners, there were I mean, there are attorneys tied into this, there's real estate people, and there was also a lot of tie into the Pentecostal church in the state of West Virginia, in that area.
Wow. And this was happening to quite a lot of children in that area.
It would seem that way. Like I said,
Yeah.
the
Mm.
sexual reactivity was very rampant. It was not one kid preying upon another. It was something that was happening a lot. I know for me, I had something called dissociative amnesia until I was 39 years old. There are things looking back, there are symptoms that make a lot of sense as an adult, as a child, like, oh, yeah, that's why that was happening. But dissociative amnesia, so dissociation happens, and I'm just going to kind of educate because I don't know, the listeners, what they know
Yep.
about trauma. But
Yep.
dissociation happens specifically. I'm going to use my example during CSA, childhood SA, when the mind needs to split from the body because it is too much. If your mind understood what was actually happening, you would not survive. And so the mind kind of splits from the body while the body endures the abuse. And sometimes when that happens, with things like trafficking, memories will be repressed. I don't like to say that they disappear because they don't truly disappear. They're just kind of compartmentalized. Your brain pushes them aside because it knows you can't take it. And sometimes when you're relaxed or when you're in a spot when your brain's like, okay, we need to process this, those memories will come dumping in. And that's what happened to me one
Wow.
night when I was married, but we'll get to that later.
Wow. And how old were you when you this happened to you?
So the first strange memory that I have, I was 3 years old. Actually, there are two. One was me trying to call 911 on a rotary phone when I was three, and yeah, and I remember an adult. It might have been my mom walking by and catching me and being like, "No, we don't do that. We don't just call 911." The other memory that I have, and this is less telling, but if you know anything about childhood psychology, it is, it illustrates really well. In We lived in two different houses. We lived in a house until I was about 3 or 4, and then we moved out into the country, which,
Mhm.
by the way, is advantageous for predators of this nature
Yeah.
because no
Yeah.
one's looking there. But in our first house, there was a hole between my bedroom closet and my dad's bedroom closet, and I remember a person could crawl through. And I remember crawling through one time, and the best way I have to describe the memory is Alice in Wonderland. Like, she comes out of the rabbit hole and she looks around, and everything seems so special. And anytime I kind of get the cringe when I hear the word special used with kids, not because there's anything inherently wrong with it, but so many predators are like, this thing is
Mm.
special that you get to
Yeah.
do.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
s
Mm.
and so I remember crawling through that hole and looking up at this world of wonder, probably because my brain had created it as such to endure what was happening.
Wow. I mean, did your family have any idea and any inclination of what was going on at the time?
Unfortunately, when, someone like my mom, who
Yeah.
everything was so normalized and was never given tools to address anything that happened to her
Mm.
personally. No,
Mm.
nobody saw the signs. Once I've started to kind of uncover and connect dots and figure more out, people are like, "Oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense now." But it was so well hidden, and you're talking about the demographic largely that was doctors. They had money, they had social clout, power.
Mm.
They could make
Mm.
anything disappear and just make me I mean, the first time I was called crazy, I was 3 years old.
And it strikes me odd that they were able to even have that alone time with you. I mean, that must have been quite a scary process because your parents would have thought, okay, these people are safe to leave my daughter with. Do you know how frequent that was? I mean, if you blocked a lot of that out, or is it like a something that you can remember the amount of
Yeah,
times you were
so first of all, I think the idea of stranger danger has been a real
mm,
disservice to kids that
mm,
we've sold because often it's not strangers. Not saying it can't be, but
mm,
it's the people that we are taught to trust without asking questions like doctors.
mm.
So my mother died. Well, she was intentionally caused to be not alive anymore when I was
Okay.
9.
Wow.
Um, but before that, my dad takes me to the appointments. My dad's in and my dad's doing, the trafficking.
Oh,
So
okay. So your dad was aware, was part of the problem. He was the one that was taking you there, and he knew what was happening.
absolutely. And
Wow.
I just realized a few days ago there was an instance with a doctor where my mom had taken me. um, I realized he was trying to do it in front of her as like a power move. And she was just incredible, even though she didn't know exactly what was happening. She was like, "Oh, absolutely not." He, I had a stomach ache constantly, which is typical of children experiencing SA. And I went to this doctor, and he was one of the main ones, but he was a little younger, a little more like aggressive in his approach, I guess. And he was like, "Well, we need to check you for worms, but we have to do a digital examination with my hand. That's not how you check for worms. You use a stool card." And my mom was like, "No." And I was crying, and I'm like, is it going to be painful, uncomfortable?" And he's like, "Of course it is." He was trying to do it in front of my mom as like a power
Wow.
move. Um,
Wow.
but
So like
yeah.
there was a ring of doctors
Mhm.
involved in essaying children, and
Yes.
your dad, was he? I mean, what was he getting from this? I mean, was he getting money? Was he getting access to something? I mean, what was his goal? His end goal?
And I'll never know for 100% for sure all of the answers, but my father had a very, very low IQ, probably about 70, maybe lower than that. And he was easily manipulated.
Okay.
So the money that was my sister's birth injury was trafficking money that had been funneled. And that's an interesting story how I kind of stumbled across that when I was in my 30s. But he was getting money. He was also, I think, probably being manipulated, but he also got pleasure out of watching us suffer. I mean, like I said, that maniacal laughter when we'd have to go to the doctor's office. He loved it.
Wow. I mean,
Yeah.
it's scary to think that the people that bring you into this world are not protecting you the way that you should have been protected. And I wholeheartedly feel, I feel so bad for you, and I can't imagine what you were going through at that time. I mean, when did you start to realize that this wasn't normal? This isn't how a child should be brought up.
When I was 39.
Oh wow, wow.
Yeah, I had no reference, and I've heard a lot of survivors, especially of things like trafficking, say similar things. I know a lot of people who let's start with narcissism, who end up in narcissistic relationships. It's just that your brain has normalized it since childhood. I didn't have a word for the things that had happened to me, and because of the dissociative amnesia, I didn't know what abuse was. I didn't know what trauma was, and every time I had tried to tell people in my life, because I had wanted to not be alive myself and had tried many, many times throughout my life since I was a teenager. And anytime I was diagnosed with severe depression and all these different things, people would say, "Well, your life's not bad. Like, look at your house, look at your things. You haven't had a bad life." So,
Wow.
anything that would start to surface, I had to suppress. And when you're surrounding yourself essentially with more of the same people, maybe in different dynamics, maybe they weren't selling me, but you're not safe. And even if your mind doesn't know you're not safe, somewhere your body, that connection knows that you're not safe and won't let you understand that it's abuse. And if you don't have a word, you don't have a reference point.
Yeah, I can see where that could potentially, you know, leave things uncovered or covered, sorry, for such a long time. I mean, when you was a teenager, were your relationships healthy? I mean, was there any kind of rebellious side to you as you were growing up?
Well, I've always been rebellious in that I'm not like a social norm person. But besides that, no, I was a very The thing, and this is a little hard for people to hear, but the thing is, I was groomed and I was trained to entertain rich men and as a child. And that did not just mean with the essay, that meant performatively, just being intelligent, being good, what we would call a good child. I went completely under the radar. No one I when my mother was when her life was ended intentionally, of course, it was passed off as something else. But I remember going to school and it was my first day of 4th grade. And a counselor said, "Hey, your mom just passed. Like, are you okay?" And I was like, "Oh, yes, she's in a better place." Just started reciting all of the things that I had been told to recite. And no one ever looked at it again. No
Wow.
one ever helped me get into college. I just flew under the radar the entire time for all of my existence.
Were you in a predominantly very religious area?
That's exactly
Yeah.
what I was getting ready to say.
Okay.
I please understand that I mean this in no harm towards people who practice certain religious practices or anything like that.
Mm,
But something that I have seen a lot of predators do is hide behind the guise of religion, particularly fringe religions. Like I was raised Pentecostal. And so, it's a little more out there and it's practiced in the mountains. And so my dad was able to hide behind the Pentecostal church, who was also in on it. But he is to this day in my hometown known as a good Christian man. And that's
really.
his whole identity.
I mean, you do see this happen with extreme versions of Christianity, more so, I do think, and like you said, it becomes a bit cult-like. And
Mhm.
would you describe it as like that as a cult religion or area that you were in? The people that were around you.
Yeah, I think at least cult
Mm,
like,
mm,
very interestingly, it was, I ended up, which we'll talk more about later, but I ended up having an experience with the Mormon church not too long ago, and it's almost like it's that level of kind of cultish mentality, but
mm,
without the money.
mm, mm.
So, yeah.
And when there comes power, there comes the abuse of power, and that's obviously what happened there. And nobody picked up on this throughout the time you were there, or they were kind of just something that was done, and nobody said anything. It was, kept under the radar.
I think that there was a combination of things happening. First of all, I recently penned the words. I'm working on writing a book about my story. I recently penned the words, "Desperation is a playground for predators." And I can think of no more desperate people than an entire state living in poverty and just not able to get out of this generational cyclical poverty and also being preyed upon by outsiders with money. And so you had a lot of people who were just trying to get their basic needs met, I'm sure, and who maybe knew something, and also with the high control religion, you're taught to be nice and stay in your place and don't upset someone. And there were a lot of reasons I think that people didn't say anything. Also, you don't want to believe that this is happening, which is not okay, but you don't want to believe it.
I mean, was the area quite what densely populated, or was it quite sparse? You didn't really have that many people. Is it a village type area?
Yeah, it was probably more like a village, I would say. I
Yeah.
don't have a lot of experience with that, but it was a smaller area. It was
Okay.
outside of the state capital, but even then, the state capital, it's a small state. Um,
And
people
was there lack of option for work, or was it, was there substance abuse in the area?
There's a lot of substance
Okay.
abuse in the area, but it wasn't as predominant then, and OxyContin was actually kind of almost trafficked into the area by actually the rich people who, created it, who saw an opportunity because we have a lot of coal mining, or we did, in the industry of the area, and so coal mining wrecks a person's body. They're on their knees doing this intense, crazy labor, and so they saw an opportunity because, the FDA only lets you do so many things because ethics and moral. And they were like, yeah, let's go to West Virginia. Let's give these people this oxy. And so they did, told doctors it wasn't addictive. Doctors are wholeheartedly thinking, here's this thing that's going to help you. And these people are getting pain relief. They're getting pain relief. And then all of a sudden they come back in, the pharmaceuticals do, and they're like, "Mm, just kidding, it is addictive, and now you can't prescribe it." So you have people who are experiencing pain again and who are now also addicted to this. And so it's caused a whole problem in the area that you see 20 years down the road. And it is also very advantageous for places that are actually doing trafficking to just blame the trafficking on the drugs. And that's not, I'm not saying it never happens, but that is not the largest part of it at all.
And you're completely right. The OxyContin was, sold as a drug that could, was slow release opioids that could, it wasn't addictive. And we found out quite quickly that it was very addictive. All opioids are.
Mhm.
Um, and it's caused havoc and chaos within a lot of America, hasn't it?
Yeah.
And especially, like you said, the mining communities, the laborers communities, they do struggle because they want pain relief, and that was what
Yeah.
was the best option. And then they have to turn to the heroin, don't they? That, I mean,
Yeah.
that's the only thing that they can take. I think, is it
Yeah.
OxyContin banned now? Is it no longer on the
It's highly
um
regulated. I'm not
okay,
sure,
sure,
but
okay.
I mean, and also you had, I mean, let's think about just the demographic of West Virginia. You have a lot of trauma there too. So
Mm.
that trauma often is one of the causes, at least to activate something like social or substance use disorder. And so, like, it was the perfect storm. Perfect storm.
Mm. Yeah, and it's so sad to think that you can trust, well, you think you can trust your doctors to prescribe you something that's safe, and it can end up ruining your life.
Mhm.
And did you see that happen to a lot of family and friends?
So my family, actually, there was a lot of substance use disorder in my family. It was not oxy specifically because that came, I think, in the
A bit
late
late.
90s.
Mm.
Yeah. But my mom had three brothers. She was the oldest. One brother died 11 months before her. He had a radical, it was 91 or 1990, a heart and lung transplant. And he had that as a result of his alcoholism. And then she had another younger brother who died about 14 days before her of an overdose. And the other brother, I don't know where he is. So yeah, substance and her dad, like you see it in my family specifically because of all of the generational trauma and the generational poverty. I mean, people don't think about the fact that poverty and being poor is continuous trauma every day.
Well, it's a struggle to survive, isn't it? And when you're
Yeah.
struggling to survive, your life is a lot harder, and you don't have that room to flourish that most
Yeah.
other people do. And it is, like you said, it's the stress of being poor is a knock-on effect for substance abuse.
Mhm.
Is that something you experienced personally?
So, the being poor part, yes. Substance use, I used to drink a lot. I used to drink a lot, but I also just was able to just quit one day. So I struggle with whether I would have, and I am able, if I want to have a drink at this point, have a healthy relationship with alcohol, but I choose not to because I no longer like the way it makes me feel.
Well
But,
done.
thank you. So it's not an issue anymore at this point, and I think it was me drinking to numb this thing that I didn't know existed. But the poverty part, absolutely. I am actually in a camper right now and homeless, have been homeless since I left a marriage that almost ended my life the same way my mother's was ended. I've been homeless for 2 years, have had to go all across America just to stay safe. Um, and yeah, I mean, cyclically, even me growing up, having access to so many resources, having access, having the nicest things. And even when I was married, I married someone who works for one of the largest tech industries in the entire world. So I always had access to money. And so it's a different world when with CPTSD in particular, it's very difficult to work. And it's very difficult to work for a lot of reasons. And also, I had a lot of brain damage, both chemically and from narcissistic type of like torture, really. Um, you see it systemically coming back up because with CPTSD, it's thought to be reactivated from childhood. It's not created. It's something that sits kind of perhaps it's a little dormant until another event kind of awakens it. And then all of a sudden you're like, what's this?
Okay, so when did you start seeing the symptoms of PTSD? Because it crops up in different ways, doesn't it? I mean, what was it for
Mm.
you?
For me, it was always those little emotional outbursts that I was talking about. Normally,
Yeah,
I am this loving, empathetic, I give too much.
yeah.
I was trained to be
Generosity.
yeah,
Mhm.
I was
Mm.
trained to be a people pleaser. That was part of my grooming. And so once that would change, once I couldn't give in the same capacity or I saw people were taking advantage of me, I would subconsciously be triggered for, it was my mind and my brain trying to save me. I'd like have an emotional outburst. It was never anything dangerous. It was never anything violent, but I was different. And so looking back, I can always see that. But when I escaped my own marriage, that's when I start to identify pieces of the CPTSD coming up really in a
Okay, and
significant
and
way.
so when was your first sort of healthy relationship?
Hmm. I've not had extremely healthy relationships
Mhm.
because um again, that normalization of such abuse that I nearly was not alive anymore, left my ex-wife, and so for the past 2 years, I've really been trying to, I've not had a relationship with this consciousness, I guess, is what I should say.
So was your wife the first person that you've fallen in love with?
No, and honestly, looking back, I never actually loved her. I can identify that and deconstruct that at this point. No, she wasn't. I've loved one person before. It ended up not being a relationship, but it's a long story. We don't need to get into that. But she was the first person that I'd ever lived with. I think I was about 28 when we got together. She was the most significant relationship I think that I'd had up until that point. I didn't realize that the things that I was like, "Oh, this is good," were just things that I wanted as a child or things that reminded me of my dad as a child.
Yes, yes, and that's a common theme actually. You see a lot that you do kind of marry into your parents slightly. There's a slight similarity with one or both of the parents.
Yeah.
I mean, with your wife, would you consider her a narcissist?
I would it's there's a lot to unpack there. With my wife, I would classify her, and I am not a therapist, though I do have a degree in human behavior. Um,
Oh, very
and
good.
thank you. A psychopath, and also with Munchausen and Munchausen by proxy, both of them.
Wow.
There's a lot to
Wow.
unpack.
And
Yeah.
is that something you must have realized after the relationship, not during, or well, maybe slightly during, but at the beginning, was you love bombed? Was you kind of
Yeah.
sucked into this idea of this beautiful relationship?
Yes, and, it was, my dad could have possibly been like a psychopath also, so it feels it feels very familiar and very comfortable,
Yeah. Mm.
that sort of, like, dry almost, love bombing, which is different from because 'cause I've had relationships with narcissists before too, and it's a little bit different, but, I tried to break up with her. I think my gut knew. I tried to break up with her a couple weeks in. As far as the Munchausen and Munchausen by proxy, I saw, but I blew past my intuition and I intellectualized it. I saw it pretty early on because if she had a hangnail, she would call her mother. And I noticed her brother would do the same thing. And I went, huh. And I kind of, thought about it for a while. And mom would have these huge reactions like, oh my God. But mom's huge reactions were so that she could call everyone in the neighborhood and get sympathy about her kids being sick. She never cared that her kids were actually sick. And so I asked her one day, a few years into our relationship, like, did you only get attention from your mom if you were sick as a kid? And she was like, yeah. And so from some of those interactions, I've put the pieces together.
Wow. Wow. That's really interesting actually. I mean, do you think that you're drawn to a type of person, because this is something that I've noticed in myself, is if you've got an empathic nature, that
Oh,
you're drawn more to the darker side of people?
so yes, here's what happens. I've noticed that, and I'm learning to work with this still.
Mm.
Call it intuition, call it hypervigilance, whatever you want to call it. When I first meet a person, I get a gut feeling about them.
Mm,
And retrospectively, it has never, ever been wrong. But
yeah.
typically, I intellectualize past it, or I let social conditioning that says, give them a chance, blah, blah, blah. All the things that we've taught to be nice, not kind, but nice. Um, so yeah,
And
I,
I understand that completely, and I think we do ignore red flags because we want the idea of them rather than the actual person sometimes. And I think you fall for what you want rather than what is actually in front of you.
yeah. And you
Um,
project your own morals.
yeah, and we can talk about your wife and how you met her if you want to go into that.
Yeah. First, I want to really quickly talk about a
Okay,
memory
sure.
from my
Oh yeah, go
childhood, the
for
day
it.
that
Yeah.
my mom was passing away. So actually, let me talk a little bit about that history first because it's going to tie into my relationship. So my mom, after she took me to the doctor, and after I don't know how much she figured out because obviously she wasn't going to tell her 9-year-old everything. But she started to get sick all of a sudden. And she was a healthy woman before this, didn't even go to the doctor, probably wasn't allowed. And all of a sudden, she starts to get sick, and it's a couple of different things. At first, they're telling her she's pregnant, and then she's um, menopausal, even though she was like 40. And then all of a sudden, she has ovarian cancer. And we're all like, okay. And so the story that I was told for all of my life that I never questioned was that this doctor, and remember the tie to doctors, this doctor, an OBGYN, went in and did a hysterectomy. Now, this was 1990, 1991. The recovery time for, first of all, it was like it's still a whole procedure, but it was like a gash from side to side if you had gotten a hysterectomy at that time. And it was like 8 weeks recovery at bare minimum, like intense major surgery. My sister had to be lifted and everything. My aunt, many years later, was like, there was no hysterectomy, Cassie. There was no hysterectomy. How would she have taken care of your sister? But that's what was sold, was that she had a hysterectomy. And there are a couple of other little surgeries in her life that I actually question for similar reasons. But I'm pretty transparent. If I don't know something for sure, if it's a memory that I've had to splice together, I'm pretty upfront because I don't want to I don't want to be
Yeah.
deceptive. But anyway, and she gets sicker and sicker, and I watch her body break down. And I remember looking at her one day and thinking, she's like an 80-year-old woman now, and sicker and sicker. And she kept saying, and my aunt has said this, no matter what I eat, I can't keep it down. Like I can't eat anything. Everything makes me sick. There's no correlation. Everything makes me sick. And so, this narrative gets passed that she has cancer. She has cancer. There's a hospital bed brought into our house the last few days that she's alive. I was told it was by hospice, but actually, another character in this player was someone who sold medical equipment. And so, anyway, my dad had a cousin who was older than him. She was very intelligent, and remember, he had a very, very low IQ. She was a real estate agent. And I always like she would send me nasty emails until she died. She just was always horrible to me. And I remember the day that my mom was passing, or the night before, actually. She was alert, she was active. My aunts even said this before. And then the next morning, she was in a coma. Now, there's this memory that I have sitting on the edge of my mom's bed while my dad and this particular cousin was forcing what looked like pudding down her throat. And I remember saying, like, why are you doing that? Like, what are you doing? And they said, oh, it's just her pain medicine. Just mind your own business. The problem is my mother had refused pain medicine through her cancer because she was Pentecostal and she believed that God was going to heal her and didn't want to be addicted to drugs. So why was she getting this medication? I I grew up, I spent my entire life until I was 39 thinking that everyone who had cancer went into a coma before they passed. Because the next morning, actually for
Mm.
12 hours or longer, she was just unconscious. And I walked up to her as a 9-year-old kid and I'm talking to her. And I rarely get choked up about anything, but if I do, it's going to be my mom or my sister. But my mom, tears started falling down her face as I'm talking to her and saying goodbye, basically. And they're just like streaming down her face. And I walk up to my dad's cousin and I'm like, my mom, she's crying. And she said, oh, don't feel special. That's just what happens when we die. That had nothing to do with you. So there was already like some grooming to make me to like disconnect me from my mom, to disconnect me from what was actually happening. I was 9 years old, and that was her response to a child. I remember that day my dad, after my mom passed, sitting on the bed in the room next to her, and I remember walking down the hallway because I could see where my mom's body was. She was still there, and I could see my dad. And he was just emotionless and canceling call waiting. That was his main thing that he needed to do that day, was to cancel call waiting because she had wanted it. And looking back, some of those moments are just so chilling. I found out later, and when we get into my wife, I'll go more into this, but I found out later because I had a friend who passed away of cervical cancer like weeks before I escaped. People don't go into a coma like that. That's not like standard operating procedure before someone passes of cancer.
I think the only time that happens more so is end of life drugs. So they can put
Right,
you on very heavy sedative drugs, and maybe it
right,
looks like that there, but they can't communicate with you, can they?
right. No.
So did your how did your dad how did he care for you after your mum passed?
Well, my mom knew in some capacity that she was not going to live much longer, and she had to make a decision that I can't imagine a mother having to make. She had nowhere because of all the generational trauma. She tried to leave him a few times. She had nowhere to go. She was too sick at some point. She looked at me and saw a smart 8, 9-year-old kid, and she saw my sister with not just like emotional needs that were, especially elevated, but also just medical needs. And she knew if she put us in the child welfare system, my sister wouldn't make it and that we would be separated. And so basically, I believe that she had to look at me and go, "You are the best shot that you guys have at surviving."
Wow. I
And
mean,
she
well done you. I mean, to get through all that is by the age of 9 is 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 such a difficult, unbelievable thing to go through. Um, Sorry, carry on. I interrupted you. Carry
No,
on.
you're okay. No, so she basically trained me on how to take care of the family because she knew my dad wouldn't. So at the age of 9, and I had started cooking a little bit before because Appalachians love to cook. Like we love to make magic from nothing because we're poor. And so I'd been interested in cooking and learning from, the women in my family. But she really, really taught me how to cook. I remember her teaching me how to balance the checkbook because my dad wouldn't do that. And she just taught me how to take care of my sister. So, how did my dad care for us? He really didn't. He did some things with my sister. And when I got to be about 16, I kind of disconnected more when I was in high school. Um, but he didn't. He didn't care for us. He would show up for things that would make him look good. But
So, I mean, when did the abuse stop for you? Was it kind of when you were old enough to know what was going on? It all faded away, or because I mean, there must have been a point in your childhood where you knew there was something different about your dad and the way he behaved.
yeah, and it from the perspective of an abuser, you
Mm.
don't want to continue this sort of abuse until they're a certain age. What if they start talking? Or, and I was a very intelligent kid. I do not know specifically, but I do have a guess. And that is probably when I left the church when I was about 16. I'm guessing it happened around then. The memory and the narrative that I told myself about leaving the Pentecostal church went like this for a long time. One day I woke up and went, "Why am I believing things that have just been always told to me? I don't actually believe these." And I left the church. But I'm sure there was a lot more to it. And I do remember the day that I left, um, I ran across the street and I was hiding in the weeds because the pastor came down and they were out yelling for me and looking for me to not leave the church. And I thought this was normal. And I mean, it is fire and brimstone, it is Pentecostal, but it's not normal to chase a 16-year-old down and be like I was hiding in the weeds. So
And suppose the way that they behaved made you question everything. You know, maybe if they had a better moral compass, you may have stayed within the church. You don't know. It might have been something you would have continued to believe in. Would you say you're an atheist now, or would you say you still have some religion?
So I would say mostly I'm an agnostic because I don't think that
Okay.
I can know, but I practice spirituality, but it's a very
Okay.
Appalachian style. It's not
Okay.
like what's trending. So it's not like the new age trending spirituality.
Okay. Brilliant. That's very interesting. And would you say you found that more so later on in life?
Oh, very much so.
Yeah.
I did not. I mean, honestly, the religious component of everything, I still have memory loss surrounding that, which
Mm,
tells me it's particularly egregious that my
mhm.
brain has not let me remember all of that yet. So yes, I stood away from far away from anything spiritual. It wasn't until I almost was not alive anymore and I was just still and broken, and I was literally, my wife was like holding me captive in my own body essentially, that I was like, "Wait, I think that there is something else perhaps." And it was when I was 39 years old.
So when you were going through all this with when your mum passed, and your sister, was she younger or older than you? She was
She's 6
older.
years older.
Older, yeah.
Mhm.
And so have you continued to care for her, or did you leave kind of West Virginia
So
and
when I was 18, or 17, I got crazy scores on all of my ACTs and things like that. I was supposed to go to Missouri for school. I had a full ride, full scholarship, never would have paid for anything. I was going to study music performance and cinematography. Went out there a few times by myself, drove myself. It was like a 13, 14 hour drive. I was 17. And the
wow.
second time I got out there and I scheduled for classes and I was like, this isn't right. And so I decided to go to a school in West Virginia, but it was about as far away from where I grew up as you could get without leaving the state. It was about 6 hours away. And that is actually where I met my ex-wife.
Okay. Okay. And so is your sister somewhere else now, or what happened with your sister?
So my sister, she actually passed away a month before I left my wife. It was actually the day after she passed away that I even asked for a divorce. My eyes were kind of open. I've actually had my sister's ashes with me through homelessness. I've carried
Oh,
her around. I still have her with me. I've tried to sprinkle, it's been a bad situation, but it's also been really cool because I realized my dad held her hostage and she's gotten to see the entire United States.
that is such a lovely way of putting it, and that's giving me goosebumps. I think that's lovely. And you should be really proud of yourself for achieving so much, and for going through all that, and what I would consider a very well-rounded human being,
Thank
very
you.
articulate, and lovely person. So,
Thank you.
you've got to pat yourself on the back for that. I don't want to get upset. I'm
You
Um,
know, I got
no,
all choked up talking
I
about her
know, I
ashes.
know, I know, I know. It's great. It's great. And so, let's go back to then when you met your
Yeah.
wife. So what was the initial meeting? What was it like?
So it was in 2001 when I was a freshman in college, and we had some of the same friends. And I went to her house because parties were at her house. She had her own apartment. And so, of course, everyone was there, college. And I remember when I met her, that gut feeling looking back was she's very apathetic. There was just something that was off about her. But we did not start dating until 2011 because I did not like her. And she told me that she did not like me either, but she was very, very vocal about it. I had come to college and I had just gotten into shape. I had lost a lot of weight. A lot of body dysmorphia and stuff happens when people experience CSA. And I had body dysmorphia. And all of a sudden, I was just ripped and exercising all the time. And I felt good about myself. Was I vain? I don't think I've ever had enough confidence to be vain because I still very much hated myself at that point. But she did not like that. I don't say this to body shame anyone, please. Like, I would never, but she was in a much larger body. And there was a component of what would happen to me during our marriage where she would watch my body become more like hers and got enjoyment out of it.
Oh,
So anyway, we met and I was like, oh no. And I, being a naive kid and also not caring about money, I've never really cared much about money until I'm so poor that I can't afford a place to live. Um, talked openly about the $1,000,000 that I would be inheriting from my sister upon her passing. I didn't care. I never thought anyone would, do something harmful for it. So she knew about the $1,000,000 from 2001 and on. And in 2011, she had a surgery for an allegedly very rare condition called Cushing's disease. And it is a real condition and it's very debilitating. It's an awful condition. And my heart goes out to anyone who has it. But she had gone across the country. She was doctor hopping to get her diagnosis. And so she comes to me and she says, "I need help. I need help going to my 6-month doctor follow-up for this brain surgery that I had. Can you help me?" And so me identifying myself as how I could help other people was like, "Absolutely." And she tricked me into she actually called every hotel that was the specific property that she wanted to find out which ones only had 1 bed, so she would trick me into sleeping with her. And I thought it was cute because what does Disney teach us? Not that I don't love Disney movies,
Well,
but
this is the thing. I loved Disney as a child, and that's all I thought romance was. I thought I'd have a a happy ending. Every
yeah,
every movie teaches you how wonderful and easy romance is.
right? And if they trick you into being with them, that's somehow even better. Like, they really love you. They
Oh
really
my
love you.
god!
So when
Wow,
she
was she older than you?
yeah, by a couple of years, by a few
Okay,
years, yeah.
yeah. Mm, mm,
So anyway, she had this naive person who was conditioned to love psychopaths to or that sort of kind of abuse. And there's $1,000,000 and it was a perfect and she had Munchausen by proxy. I was so healthy when we started dating. I didn't keep Tylenol in the house. I didn't keep Tums in the house. I didn't keep medicine in the house. I'm actually descended from Appalachian granny witches, which is like just kind of they were the old healer ladies that sat in town. And
wow.
because we didn't have access to things like medicine and going into town and things like that. So they just kind of sat in the mountains and would like use what was around.
So it
So
was
I've
like herbs and potion kind of base
yeah. Like
formulas.
mindsets and things like
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
working with
Mm,
people. And so I've just always been extraordinarily healthy. And then all of a sudden I get with my ex-wife and over the next decade my health starts to fail slowly. My weight skyrockets to 512 pounds when like I told you I had gotten really healthy. I wasn't my thinnest at the point when I got with her, but I was a vegetarian and had been a vegetarian for 10 plus years. I was very mindful about everything that I put into my body. At some point, that did change because I gave up, but, you know
Do you think that she was a feeder, or was she stressing you to a point that you were eating excessively? Because that the stress can make you eat as well. It can go 2 directions, can't it?
yes, it can. So, interestingly, all of what you just said ties in to her brain surgery diagnosis, which I would also later get brain surgery for. Um, right. So, cortisol is the hormone that makes you eat more when you're stressed.
Mhm.
Was there some of that? Yes, but that wasn't why I was gaining weight. I was gaining weight because she was I think I can say the word. She was poisoning me with an agent that's very easy to get, um, and is actually what they were using on my mom 30 years earlier.
What?
I no longer
How
name
freaky is this that ties in with your past? You can we name the drug that was used?
I don't anymore
Ah,
because when I educate survivors who are going through it, I'm also educating predators and people have hurt
oh,
animals.
okay.
It's
Okay, okay,
yeah. Like, I
wow.
want to say it, but it's very easy to get. Most households have it in them already. It's flavorless, clear. It's easy. Easy.
Does it give any other side effects apart from weight gain?
Oh, yeah, and actually a lot of people don't gain weight with this. A lot of
Okay.
people lose weight and become emaciated. I was, retaining fluid. So all of a sudden I go from not having Tylenol to being diagnosed with things like congestive heart failure in my 30s. Congestive freaking heart failure. It was fluid sitting on my lungs and my heart, and that's all it was. I'm fine now. I do have a little heart damage from it, but um, all of a sudden I have these GI issues that were horrendous. Like I got scurvy scurvy, the old pirate disease where they didn't have vitamin C for months at a time because they were, ravaging ships. I got
Mhm.
scurvy because I couldn't eat broth. Broth was too like adventurous for me, so I didn't get vitamin C for months and months. Uh, But my body kept swelling and all the
And things
doctors
like
like
that.
that. And I started rattling off the things that he was testing me for. Because he was an oncologist, hematologist, they test for things like nutritional deficiencies and some sort of buildups that happen in the environment, but can also be intentional poisoning. And so he tested me preliminarily for a couple of those, and he was going to do a hair test on me, which would have caught all of it. But she convinced me to shave my head before my next appointment.
No.
I was so sick, I couldn't walk across the room, so showering was really hard, and she kept forgetting to order me a shower chair and would not allow me to order it for myself. Congestive heart failure, right? That's what I was diagnosed with, one of many things. And so finally, she's like, "Why don't you just shave your head? It could be really empowering." And flipped it around into this sort of narrative of where I was making this decision. And I just remember going to that next doctor's appointment and he kept like he touched my head like he was very confused, but he was trying to be kind. He was like, "I like your haircut. Why'd you do it?" He was about to test my hair. And
Unbelievable.
and then she wound me up just to ensure nothing happened with this doctor's office. She wound me up. She told me he was hiding information from me and just watched me go off on the office so that I cut contact.
Unbelievable. And this is, this is a very cunning and calculating thing to do. And what was her intention? Why was she trying to was her end goal to kill you?
Yes, because so part of it ended up was a little bit of that psychopathic like cats,
Yeah.
they kill things to play. It was kind of some of it was that. She enjoyed watching me as my body started swelling and growing because I was more like her. I was more on an even playing field. And also that $1 million inheritance. So in
Mm,
2017, I think,
mm.
she and I both became guardians and conservators of my father and my sister. And conservators, if anyone doesn't know, are the ones who get to say how the money what happens to the
Yes.
money.
Well, so
She
Britney Spears' conservatorship is that's kind of how we've all got to know about it now. And
Yes.
why was she part of that? Because she's not.
I thought it was very normal at first when she
Ah,
was like, "Oh, yeah, I'll be co-conservator with you." I was like, "Yeah, sure." And then I found out later that's not what spouses do. They don't. And similarly, I just want to add this another parallel to my story. When I went back after my dad got diagnosed with dementia, which is why we had to take, or I had to take guardianship and conservatorship, I was going through his house, which was just in disarray. And I found paperwork from the 90s. And I was like, oh, court documentation for conservatorship, guardianship. I recognize this. It was for his parents, which I knew was a thing. But his cousin was co-conservator and co-guardian, the same one you might remember from my story force feeding my mom the night before. And there were life insurance policies I later found in her name.
wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So your life, it's like it repeated itself.
Yes.
Almost, identical to that what you went through as a child.
And in fact, and I might get choked up talking about this. The day that I had left my ex-wife and I had asked for so my sister passed away on June 12th. Like 2 days later, I asked for a divorce because I had reactively yelled at her. And even psychopaths can have real tears if it's about them, right? So I'd said something that actually triggered her from childhood and I'd asked for a divorce. So she knew this was coming and had had time to try to plan it. And for some reason, the last 2 weeks that I was there, I could not be in the house. I was driving from our house to our college town, which was 15 minutes away. I was doing that drive about 10 hours a day. I could not be in the house. So she was not able to dose me as much. But the day that I left, I had no idea what the date was. I had no idea what the time was. It was a Sunday night. I was like, okay, tomorrow morning I'm leaving. On Monday, I'm leaving. I had a place to go. I had a plan. I go in, I get my stuff. Do all the things, trying to talk to her to keep everything at bay and just to get the heck out. And something stops me when I get to my car, which I don't know. I never listened to those quiet moments. And it said, take a picture of yourself. Like, just take a picture. You're going to want to remember this. So I take a picture and I put it away. And a couple months later, I pull it out for some reason or run across it on my phone. And I notice the date and the time. And I'm like, wait a minute, July 25th. I know that date. Isn't this? And I pulled my mom's death certificate. My mom died on July 25th, 1992 at 11:15 a.m. I
It's okay.
escaped July 25th, 2022, 11 a.m. I was 15 minutes shy of the 30-year anniversary of her being murdered.
Wow.
30
You
years
know,
exactly.
there is something written sometimes. I really do believe that your destiny is kind of can be foreshadowed. I I think that's remarkable, but that must have given you some strength at the same time. Did it
Yeah.
make you feel like that you were meant to be leaving her? You knew that it was the right decision to make.
Yeah, I mean, it did, and it's helped me. That tie alone has helped me kind of retroactively work through so much because honestly, I had to go back and deconstruct my mom's childhood to fully understand what had happened in mine because there were so many parallels. There was so much that got ignored because they were so similar.
And I mean, the similarities and history does repeat itself because it's also learnt behavior as well. I mean, when you were getting sick, and the similarities of not being able to keep food down, as your mum couldn't either. Did it all just start to click and come together once you were recovering?
No, so, as I said, I was extraordinarily healthy before my ex-wife,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
when I left it was almost August when I left. By December, I had lost 100 pounds because it was just fluid, and my health had immediately started to get better. She had cut off all access to money, which meant I couldn't go to the doctor, couldn't get my 2-gallon bags full of medication. I was on 5 blood pressure medicines. I had a thyroid condition allegedly, all these things, and I had to decide I'm not gonna take this anymore. What do I stop taking? Do I take my diabetes meds? All these things. And the answer is I didn't need any of the medications. And so as soon as I left, my health started to improve. And the size of my body and like there's some permanent damage. So there's some lymphatic damage, some kidney damage, some heart damage. But my health, I don't take anything again. And so I remember leaving and someone saying, do you think she poisoned you? Like a lot of people were like, do you think she poisoned you? Because, people don't usually just turn around and not have congestive heart failure or diabetes anymore. And I was like, "No." It took me a while to actually figure out and to receive the idea that someone had done that to me.
And that must have been quite a shock to start to put the pieces together and think, wow, I mean, this is also something that my mum went through as well. And
Yes.
that's such a rare thing for both of you to be poisoned.
Yes.
And I mean, going back to the fact that she was, cut you off from money. How was she in charge of your finances?
So she and you 90 I love to quote the statistic because I think it's so important for
Yeah.
people who are going through abuse. 99% of domestic violence, domestic abuse, whatever coercive relationships includes financial or economic abuse. 99%. So she not only so I worked hard before her. I was working 90 to 100 hours in like healthcare sort of management sort of thing. I've done so many different jobs and I've gotten promoted quickly and everything. But she pretty quickly convinced me that I was too crazy to work. And then I was too sick to actually work. And so there was that level of financial control, but she also created anxiety around finances, which I don't love finances anyway. I've told you I don't like money, whatever. She created such anxiety around it that I never even looked. So not only was she manipulating our finances, but she was manipulating my sisters and my dad's because she was in charge of them.
Wow.
And most of our stuff is actually supposed with the conservatorship, it's supposed to be reported to the court system. But she would create fear around that and then all of a sudden say, you do all the paperwork. This is your job. This is your problem. And I would just be sitting there freaking out, like, I don't know how to do this. I'm so scared. So none of the documentation ever got turned into the court. And I can't do it at this point. So there's no trail. She has family on the Supreme Court of the state in which we lived. divorce was fun for that reason.
Wow. And you
Yeah,
just became highly reliant on her basically managing your life. And I think
absolutely.
they create a kind of narrative where you feel like you have to depend on them, that you can't live without them.
Mhm.
And did it take quite a while for you to adjust without her?
So first of all, she did it also, and you see this a lot of I'm taking care of you too.
Yeah.
Like, I love you, and that's why I'm doing this. No, I was actually this is strange. I was actually hyper independent before her.
Yeah.
But with childhood wounds, you see a lot of attachment issues. And that idea of someone taking care of me, I guess no one had ever done it, including as a child, besides my mom for the 9 years she was around. So that idea just felt great. And then as I started to get sick, it was like, oh, thank God you're here. So as soon as I left, besides the medical issues and uh, the CPTSD was really bad, but also you have to realize I was poisoned. It wasn't just the brain differences from the narcissism or the psychological torture and all that. Like my brain was actually, I couldn't put sentences together when I
Wow.
left. So did it take a long time? Financially, yes, but everything else, no.
And she's chemically imbalanced your brain to a point of kind of being frazzled, I suppose, and left. You have to heal from the bottom up.
Yeah, at that point,
But
yeah.
we're going to do a part two because we've got a lot more to cover. What are we going to talk about in part two, Cassie?
Well, I want to talk about maybe some of the end of that relationship and also what I've seen over the past 2 years, because all of these things, particularly if you're like me and you have dissociative amnesia, I know people look at survivors sharing their stories and they go, that's too much for one person's life. Like, why, why all their life? But there's a reason for it. There's a reason, and there are systemic reasons for it also. So I'd like to talk about what I've seen over the past 2 years and what I've experienced.
And have we got a bit about the Mormons as well?
I do have a little bit
Yeah.
about the Mormons.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, it's going to be very interesting. And thank you so much for joining me today. It's been absolutely fascinating. And I am, overwhelmed with emotion with you. And I feel it really, you've really inspired me, put it that
Oh,
way.
thank
I think
you.
you're an amazing human being.
Thank
Um,
you.
and we're going to put all of your links in the description box.
Thank you.
So you can contact Cassie on her socials. She's got her own Spotify podcast, and you're on Instagram as well. What else are you on?
TikTok and Instagram for now.
TikTok and Instagram. Perfect. So I'll put all the hyperlinks in the description box. Thank you so much for joining me, and we'll do a part two, and we'll arrange it off air. And
All right. Thank
yeah,
you.
thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining me today. It's been wonderful. Thank you for sharing your story.
Of course.
Thank
It's my
you.
pleasure.
No worries.